Hello, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. This is the launch of the Trackers Brexit Forum, which is going to run monthly, at least until the end of January, with briefing papers in the Tracker on Brexit's impact, mainly on the Irish and the Luxembourg and the UK industries, but doubtless we will get into Malta and indeed the main continental European countries as well. For those of you that don't know us, IFI Global is a research and a media house based in the City of London, and the Tracker is one of our 3 publications. And we are absolutely delighted to be working on our a Brexit Forum project with Karina Vaughan and Catalina Consulting. Today we have Simon Firth, who is a partner at the international law firm Arnold & Porter, and also Robert Meller, who's a partner at PwC. They're both Brexit experts, and as Rob was just saying a second ago, he's led the PwC coverage of Brexit for the EMEA region as a whole. So we're very, very pleased to have them both. And Karina Vaughan, my partner, is helping me, thank goodness, with the technology, so I can do the prattling away here while she operates the technology. Unfortunately, she's not feeling particularly well, so she won't be appearing on the screen today. So let me start with a short presentation on what we think are the major issues to do with Brexit's impact upon the industry. And then I'm going to ask Simon and Rob to make 5-minute introductory comments. Then after that, we very much want this to be a free-for-all. And for the first time, we've done many forms of online events since the pandemic arrived. But today, for the first time, we are going to try and use the hands up facility on Zoom. And you are absolutely all encouraged, should you wish to do so, to use that. That means we will bring you on, bring your video on up to the screen. So you will be, whilst you ask the question, seen by the other audience members. Please do take advantage of that. To repeat, we very much encourage that. We want to make this forum today absolutely as interactive as we possibly can. If you don't wish to reveal yourself to the public at large, you are also very welcome to use the Q&A facility that you will see on the bottom of your screen. So you can ask a question in the written form as well. So as I say, I'm going to probably repeat this many more times before we finish. We really do want to make this interactive. That's the name of the game today. So let me start with my short presentation. I thought I would put up a brief history of how we got to where we are today. And you might be wondering, why on earth why is the first item on this particular slide AIFMD introduced in July 2011? Well, I think actually most people have neglected or don't know the importance that the introduction of the directive, or more perhaps the preliminary period before the introduction of the directive, had upon the radicalization of the alternative fund industry in the UK, especially hedge fund and private equity managers, but others as well, in turning the UK against the EU. And one of the things that many very angry alternative managers did was they promised David Cameron, if he was to put in the 2015 manifesto, a referendum on Europe, they would substantially increase their donations to the Tory party. Obviously, the prime reason he did that was to head off UKIP. And also, he probably didn't expect to get a majority in 2015. He was in coalition with Liberal Democrats at the time. But definitely, he thought it would be a good way of replenishing the coffers of the Tory parties because of the annoyance many people, not just the traditional or the well-known names of Chris Nodis, but people like Helena Morrissey, a very well-respected figure in the city, was quoted at the time as saying, "Enough is enough, it's time to leave the EU." And so one should probably start when one's doing the history of how we got to today with the introduction of the directive. And one more point perhaps is not that well known. Guess who was behind the early drafts of AIFMD? None other than one Michel Barnier, who didn't speak back then, even to this day, particularly good English, but he was the guy in Brussels who was responsible for the introduction of the original drafts. It got less bad as it went along. There were many redrafts, but that was his first foray into the UK. And as I say, he, in a sense, contributed to the position that we find ourselves in today. The rest of the stuff on this screen is very self-evident. The one thing I would say is here, we picked this date today because we thought Boris Johnson had said by the middle of October, he would have definitely made his mind up whether he was going to walk away from the talks or whether or not, if they continued post the middle of October, we were basically on for some form of trade deal. Well, here we are after the middle of October, and guess what? Nothing is really clear. It's still very much up in the air, as doubtless you all know, as to whether or not we will leave with some sort of skinny trade deal or not. It seems to change daily, if not hourly. And I suspect that's going to go on for a little bit longer, but the clock is ticking. And on December the 31st at midnight, we are out lock, stock and barrel, and we are out of the single market. We are out of the customs unions. As of the 1st of January, 2021, that is an absolute definite. That is one deadline that's not going to be missed. That's what's going to happen. Briefly, what is going to be the impact on the fund industry, as I say, in Ireland, in Luxembourg, in the UK, and indeed across the EU as a whole, of the situation that we find ourselves in today? Well, to my great surprise, I didn't expect this. I think probably not a lot of other people did either. There will be no deal on equivalence, at least this year. Both the UK and the EU missed the June 30th deadline to get their act together to be able to recognize each other's financial services regimes, which is really extraordinary considering we've been in the EU for as long as we have, but that is indeed what happened. Then shortly after that, the person responsible for financial services in the EU, who has a name I have difficulty in pronouncing, he's Latvian, Valdis Dombrovskis, I'm sorry, that's probably a terrible pronunciation of his name, then announced that the EU was anyway too busy to be able to judge the equivalence for the rest of this year because they had too many other things going on. So no agreement even on equivalence. When Theresa May was Prime Minister, we all thought the least we would get, we thought we'd get more than this, but the least we would get would be equivalence. So that is not happening. Whether it happens next year or not, I don't know, but we're certainly not getting it before January 2021. So what are the other short-term implications of where we are today? A lot, of course, has already been decided. The big fund management groups have set up in Dublin or Luxembourg, or they've done whatever they needed to do to prepare for this. They've had a huge amount of time. So it's not like this is a big surprise. The one area that I think could be very contentious very early on next year will be distribution. That is not clear as to how that will work out, and we'll probably come back to that in the discussion, including, as I put here, private placement. And that came up in a statement the EU made this week. Indeed, there may be a potential review of private placement. Some of you may know, and this came up in our prep call, in April next year, there is the cross-border distribution directive. These will be the first sets of directives coming out of Brussels that the UK has not been involved in. We don't know what will be in that, but of course that is uncertainty, and goodness knows where we will be when we get to April next year. We have the second iteration of AIFMD that's been going through. I think it clearly was delayed because of Brexit. The start of the review happened a good few years ago now. The expectation is that that will be coming out in the middle of next year. But it's been delayed and changed so many times that who knows, that could be put back again as well. There are two things happening in June next year. The EU Investment Firms Regulation and Directive, IFR and IFD. Again, we don't know what's going to come through that, but there will be uncertainty. And I do expect, even in the short term, we'll come on to what delegation later, interference. Already ESMA, I understand, is getting involved and wanting to oversee delegation, portfolio management delegation decisions coming out of Luxembourg especially, but also Ireland. And then there could be data transfer issues, especially in this Zoom era and this the unusual situation we find ourselves in because of the pandemic. Just one last quick word. I mean, one of the key things on distribution is, I think it's fair to say, a lot of the way the industry has worked up to now, if you're a UK fund manager, you've gone and set yourself up with an AIFM in Dublin or Luxembourg, but the portfolio management has obviously still been done in London, and the people responsible for the sales and marketing are also in London, and they've jetted off to wherever it is in Europe to work with distributors to get those funds sold. That, I think, could clearly be called into question very early next year. So medium term, beyond, by which I mean beyond what may happen in the course of 2021, I do think we are going to see significant, and I do mean significant, regulatory divergence. Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK, Rishi Sunak, even before we knew that the equivalence agreement wasn't going to happen, has said that the UK will be going its own way from the beginning of next year in terms of financial services regulation. He has specifically mentioned changes to PRIPS, changes to Solvency II. I'm surprised with all the other things he's got on his plate, he even knows what PRIPS is, but he did mention that. And then Andrew Bailey, who when he was at the FCA, said that he thought it was very desirable indeed to have a lighter touch AIFMD regime for smaller managers above the threshold. And I believe that's very much in the works too. So that, I think, is going to happen. I do think, I've already mentioned delegation once, that it's, I wouldn't say certain, but it's close to certain that there will be a curtailment, and we will get into discussion of what kind of curtailment it will be on delegation, portfolio management delegation of European funds. I emphasize European funds that are domiciled in places like Dublin and Luxembourg, because I think the American funds that are there, or the Japanese funds that are there, or the emerging market funds that are there, they will carry on as before. There will be no change to them. But what the EU is saying, it's as kind of part of its proximity test, that if it's a European fund investing in European markets on behalf of European savers, and the figure quoted in the FT, we've been quoting 1.8 trillion pounds, I think the FT quoted just over 2 trillion. It's a lot of money that's run through London for European investors. They really, ESMA and the Commission, the powers that be in the continent, want to have greater control over that. And I think that is coming, whether London likes it or not. And I do think there'll be further substance requirements heaped on, especially on Luxembourg. And just this week, by luck, we had the revisions to CP 86 coming out. The thing that I took out of that, there were several things I took out of that, but one of them was the fact that the CBI is insisting that at bare minimum, absolute bare minimum, the smallest sort of AIFM, there has to be at least 3 full-time, not part-time, but full-time qualified, they emphasize qualified people working in those entities. And of course, the larger ones, many more than that. The other thing I took out of that was that there was quite a lot in the CP 86 review, that everything has to be documented, everything has to be meticulously recorded, and in a way that the CBI doesn't appear to think it has been up until now. And it raises the question, as we build substance in these jurisdictions like Ireland and Luxembourg, will Mancos there start to become responsible for distribution and portfolio management in the way that they're currently responsible, AIFMs in those jurisdictions, for risk? Will there be an equivalent role for them in portfolio management? And indeed, will there have to be people in those countries making distribution decisions, going out and doing the selling, etc.? And the last thing I put on there, which is hasn't been given nearly enough coverage, and we will see more of this doubtless next year, is that the AMF, in particular in Paris, the French regulator, is very keen to have more oversight of what goes on in places like Luxembourg and Ireland. Robert Ophel has said that he wants to have, because funds going into France or funds going into Germany for the Germans, they want to have more overview on what the regulatory requirements are from those jurisdictions. He called them, in a slightly disparaging way, the Europe's quote unquote export centres. I didn't think he meant that in a particularly flattering way. And I've got a quote which I found in preparation for this talk this morning that Esma made. Esma, and by the way, and the AMF very close, they're both based in Paris. Esma wrote back about a year or so ago that EU states that do not have large domestic fund markets, quote, might have little incentive to assign adequate resources to the supervision of funds sold elsewhere, unquote. And I did wonder when I was preparing my comments for today, whether or not Ireland and Luxembourg in particular have had from 2016, when we had the Brexit referendum, up until the end of this year, a bit of a Brexit honeymoon. Is that honeymoon going to be coming to an end? Is the pressure going to be put upon them in a way that hasn't been the case up until now? And in Ireland's case, there's been a lot of talk about potential changes to their corporation tax regime and have some coordinated corporation tax levels across the EU. Those are the sort of things that might be coming as well. Finally, before we get into the panel, I just want to raise two longer term issues. Are we now looking, as we go into next year and beyond, at rivalry, competition in a way that hasn't existed up until now between the UK and the rest of the EU? For example, and it has been discussed before, there's nothing going on at this moment, but there's something on the shelf in the Treasury. Will the UK seek to compete with Ireland and Luxembourg as an international fund jurisdiction? And might Paris and/or Frankfurt become the EU's capital markets and investment management centres to compete with London? The great Achilles heel of the EU is that it doesn't have a major capital markets or investment management centre. It's a very difficult thing to create. You can't just wave a wand and do it overnight. You've got to have the traders, you've got to have the brokers, you've got to have all sorts of infrastructure. There really isn't any of that really, particularly even in Paris or Frankfurt at the moment to any significant degree. But I'm sure the EU will be looking to do that in the future. So that's enough for me for the time being. I'm now going to bring in the panel. I'm just going to press this. Hopefully you will now be, fantastic. You should be able to see Simon and Rob on the screen. And Simon, can I ask you to make your, come in first, and any reaction to that, any thoughts you have on what's been said up to now?
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. And good morning, everybody. And thank you, Simon, for having me on the panel. I thought I'd kick off by presenting a few thoughts on whether there would be a deal or not. And initially just looking at that short-term scenario, but maybe touching on what might happen later on. So just going to pick up on some of the points that Simon discussed on his earlier slides. The first thing we mentioned was whether this is in the context of a no deal, I think. I mean, nobody can predict quite what will happen, and in classic EU style, no doubt a white rabbit will be pulled out of the hat at the 11th hour. But if there is a no deal, and there does seem to be some history of thinking about no deals within the government. The first thing we mentioned was that there is no agreement on equivalence. So I don't think in the short term that's going to make a huge difference. If we're looking at alternative investment fund managers, they've sort of hedged the Brexit outcome for some time now and have appropriate arrangements in place. I was listening to the Irish Funds conference yesterday, and there were people there, for example, from Goldman Sachs saying, look, everything's all sorted out. The only wobblies we're worried about now is what the EU and ESMA are going to do about delegation. So I'm sure we'll talk about that a little more. So, anybody who needs a passport, they've got the arrangement in place using a Manco in Lux, Dublin, wherever. The national private placement rules are still in place, implemented with various degrees of flexibility or rigidity depending upon the particular jurisdiction. And the cooperation arrangements are in place with ESMA to enable the MPPRs to be implemented. Interestingly, then we discussed distribution uncertainty. This is more of a critical issue, I guess, if you've got your distribution people based in London. So, you know, if they're seconded to the Luxembourg or Dublin manager, then to what extent should they be operating from Luxembourg, Dublin? If they're operating mainly from London and going into the EU, how much of a problem is that going to be? We know from ESMA's pronouncements that they have issues about people working on a temporary basis, and whether that raises questions of whether the arrangements are in line with substance and delegation requirements under AIFMD and UCITS. And then it relates also to the question of resourcing. So Simon mentioned the central bank pronouncements this week on CP86, on its findings on guidance on fund management company effectiveness. And it found many fund management companies didn't have appropriate levels of resources in place to ensure effective implementation of the CP86 framework. And particularly they're talking about the number of full-time staff there and whether they're actually doing their job well enough. And it did come out with some relatively firm conclusions that things aren't quite operating in the way that they should be. AIFMD2, where's that going to take us? Again, we've had the AIFMD review. Simon mentioned that quite coincidentally yesterday, the EU Commission has come out with a questionnaire and thoughts on following up from the AIFMD, the AIFMD review from earlier this year. And there's some interesting questions that it raises in there. And I think this is the fundamental issue here, at least in the short to medium term, as to where the EU is going to go with tightening up on AIFMD. You know, so if restrictive provisions are put in place, is that going to be a threat on delegation, for example, to the UK's asset management industry? We are the second largest fund management centre in the world, managing 8.5 trillion according to the FT. Simon also mentioned that 2.1 trillion of that is for EU investors. So this is not something to be sniffed at. So I'm looking at the questions that the Commission's raising. They're asking whether national private placement regimes create an uneven playing field between EU and non-EU AIFMs. Well, there are one or two things there that if you're a non-EU IFM, you don't need a depository if you're marketing under the PPRs, unless you're going somewhere like Germany, for example. If the UK, funnily enough, will become a third country, so maybe that works in our favour. But I think clearly if the NPPRs were going to be shut off, that would be a fundamental problem for us, particularly if the UK wasn't then an approved third country under Article 37 of AIFMD, where you can effectively take a member state of reference and be regulated in the EU. So the next question they ask is, are the delegation rules under the AIFMD appropriate to ensure effective risk management? So ESMA had earlier noted that existing EU rules say delegation should be for clear business reasons and not undermine the effectiveness of supervision by national regulators, but do not set prescriptive limits. They asked if the EU should go further by setting quantitative limits on delegation and having a list of core critical functions. And it seems to me that in sentiment, the Commission with its questions coming out this week is following that line with perhaps an underlying threat that that's the direction that they're going to go in. So quite how you set quantitative limits on delegation will be an interesting matter to discuss. Then they're asking whether the AIFMD delegation rule should be complemented. So as a reminder, the rules are at the moment that you can delegate provided you can justify it on objective reasons. The delegate must dispose of sufficient resources to perform its tasks, and the persons who conduct the business must be of sufficiently good repute and sufficiently experienced. And you'll know if you delegate risk and portfolio management, the delegate has to be authorised, or the regulator of the AFM has to consent. And there have to be co-op agreements in place as well, which there are now in the UK. So I think, you know, one point we were mentioning the median term is if the UK becomes a third country under Article 37, what that might mean. That may not necessarily be a good thing, because to get the passport, you'd then be regulated in a member state of reference as well as the UK. So I'm not sure there's a lot of clamour for that. So those are just some thoughts on that. And then just quickly to wrap up, I mean, by specific reference to Luxembourg and Ireland, you know, Luxembourg has, under its own national law, permitted delegation to UK investment managers. And it's clearly very much in the interests of Dublin and Luxembourg to have the current delegation model work. And if there are threats to that, clearly it's not just a threat to the UK, it's a threat to that model and how it can be adapted in a new environment where perhaps in 3 or 4 years' time, the screws are being turned on delegation. And just to wrap up, again, in the Irish central bank's findings this week, they were also highlighting delegation issues. They were more sort of detailed, but finding people didn't have proper policies and procedures in place, or if they did, they hadn't been followed. They found many managers were relying on a group risk management framework within the group of the actual sponsor, and didn't have entity-specific provisions in place. And an interesting one is conflicts of interest. So I think conflicts of interest is always simmering under the surface, particularly with the mancos where the sponsor is effectively the client. So whether new problems will arise in managing conflicts of interest under a new world where much more focus is put on delegation, substance, and so on, we'll just have to see. So I think my 5 minutes is definitely up at that point. So I'll hand back to Simon.
Thanks. And Rob, can I ask you for some opening comments as well?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Simon, for the invite to be here today. I'll keep it short, and I'll focus on the short term. And by short term, I'm really thinking like almost now to the end of December. So, you know, because we're seeing some real issues and pressures, some of which you both mentioned. And let's be clear: at the moment, post 31st December, UK managers lose the passport rights to continue to manage EU funds and to market funds into the EU. As you both said, you know, the expectation is that delegation will continue beyond the 31st December. No doubt it's going to be looked at, no doubt it's going to be revised, but the delegation model of either having your own Manco or having a third-party Manco acts as effectively the lead manager and then delegating portfolio management to the UK, you know, will still be there. And as Simon said, a great deal of people have already got that in place. I think, though, those models need to be carefully looked at. And indeed, not everyone does have those in place. In fact, we've been approached by a client this week who has not done anything in terms of Brexit, and therefore the solution they've now come up with is they're actually going to be buying a Lux Manco. It's the only way they can rapidly get something in place potentially before the year end. So there are still people out there who have been waiting, expecting a deal, expecting maybe a further transition, who really have to engage with both the delegation issue and the marketing issue. But let's put the delegation issue to one side. I think the hot topic, and I touched on it, is the marketing issue for two reasons really. One, we have a number of clients who engaged with regulators, Lux Ireland, elsewhere, over the last 2 years, 18 months, and have put plans in place, set out proposals for how they're going to operate their structures. And actually, I think some of those early proposals may now be considered to be a bit light by the regulators. And you both touched upon how much the CP86 review by the CBI is really focused on substance and seniority, the need for a CEO, the need for skilled people, the need for full-time people. And therefore, the benchmark as to the level of substance you need, both in relation to Manco and sales. And we are increasingly seeing the CBI ask for a head of sales to be based in Ireland if you've got significant sales activity being run over an Irish structure with a network of salespeople operating in Europe. So I think that even those people that have got plans in place and have been holding off implementing them I think there's a bit of a sense check as to whether they're going to be robust enough. We're definitely seeing a lot of pushback on fly-in, fly-out. So people from the UK effectively having dual hats or dual employment and delivering some of these roles. Again, goes to the heart of the CP86 review. You know, they're temporary, they're part-time, they're not committed, they're not on the ground. What happens if there's a real flare-up urgent issue and they're not in situ? So you can see that fly-in, fly-out model. You can see secondments being challenged, both in terms of domestic-owned mancos and the third-party managers. And on the other side of that, we have seen a lot of the alternative managers, looking, especially to the small and medium-sized ones, looking to the third-party manager solution in Ireland and Luxembourg, including on distribution. And there's a huge range of offerings there, again, including secondments, including temporary staffing arrangements, including chaperoning, through to tied agent structures, through to other delegation models. So a huge range of solutions out there across that third-party manco industry. Some of those I'm not sure will survive till the end of this year or beyond the early part of next year, because we're again seeing a toughening for those third-party mancos from the regulators in terms of things like chaperoning and things like secondments. I think in terms of secondments, you need the Lux regulator, for example, to approve the seconded employee. My understanding is there is only actually one of those sort of agreements in place, and that is time limited to the 31st of March. So a lot of secondment requests have gone in and they're just not being reviewed or not being given a decision by the Lux regulator. So even that third party manco model that you may have signed up for and you may think you have in place, I think as the regulators now deal with effectively a no deal scenario, and I'll come on to that in a moment, they're really having to double down on, okay, what is the level of substance we need? Are we comfortable with some of the things we've signed off on? Are we comfortable with some of the sort of market practices that are emerging? Because we are going to be regulating these responsibilities, from 1 January. So I think we're seeing a lot more inquiry from regulators about what's really going to happen. And so, still, a couple of months to go. There's a lot of groundwork to ensure that the implementation is going to be robust. In terms of the deal, I'm going to strike a slightly more optimistic note than maybe both of you so far. When Simon and I spoke last week, I think Simon, you seem to be thinking that no deal was the direction of travel, and I was pretty confident that Boris would row back and negotiations would continue. I expect there will be a free trade agreement done. I think it won't happen until something like the 9th or 10th of November, because both sides are waiting to see the outcome of the US election. If the Europeans are hoping that Biden gets in and therefore is more pro-Irish, and obviously I imagine that the UK government is hoping Trump gets in and there's more chance for a UK-US free trade agreement, which might put pressure on the EU to do a deal. So both sides are really holding back a bit to work out who has more cards in their hands post the US election. But by mid-November, they need to do a deal. And I think there will be a free trade deal. And whilst that won't cover equivalence may happen in certain areas. Don't forget, we already have the EU granting equivalence to CCPs in the UK. They did that at the end of September. It runs for 18 months. But it's interesting that grant very specifically says it is done for the purpose of allowing the EU to build out its own counterparty environment. So to your point, Simon, to build out sort of competing infrastructure. But the thing about the free trade agreement, if it happens and gets signed, it will include, as the ones with Japan and Canada and others do, a sense of acceptance of a need to move forward on regulation and supervisory cooperation. There are over 40 areas of equivalence, and both sides do have draftings for some of those areas. If a free trade deal was moving in a direction of positivity and goodwill, could we see some of those enacted? Maybe not before year end, but definitely in terms of an ongoing cooperative environment in early next year. So I'm hoping that we're going to see some breakout of goodwill, some sense of these areas need to be dealt with to allow financial services to operate. But obviously, one of the key areas which is still out there is data and data equivalence and how data will move in and out of the EU post Brexit. That sort of flared up as a bit of an issue recently. I guess the other thing I would say is this is not all one way. The UK, we've reopened the temporary permissions regime. So if there are EU managers listening in, the window's reopened to register so that you can distribute EU funds into the UK. or register to become a manager to manage UK funds and set up in the UK. And I think the numbers from the FCA this week was something over 1,000 or around 1,200 applications already in place. So huge interest for EU businesses to want to operate in the UK going forward. Because don't forget, the UK is quite a significant centre of asset gathering and capital raising itself. And so in the medium to longer term, the ability of the UK to turn off some of those market access points for the EU, would become part of that competitive discussion that you ended with, Simon, in your long-term piece. So I'll stop there. I'll focus a lot on the short term, but I'll stop there and Simon, pass back to you.
Thank you. I have to say, Rob, if you think the US election result will be clear by early to mid-November, I think you're potentially being very, very, very optimistic. And if that's what the game is, then we could still be negotiating this up until the inauguration, which is in late January. I hope you're right that it is decided just the week after next, I think the election is, but and I think you're also right that Biden's got very strong connections, or the Irish government has got very strong connections with the Biden campaign. The British government doesn't at all. So that could be something that has some sort of impact. Can I ask you both, and by the way, before I ask you this question, let me repeat what I said at the very beginning. Now is the moment of truth. We'd love to get you involved. Those of you who are out there, please do use either the Q&A button at the bottom or put your hand up and we'll try and bring you in to ask your question live on the screen. Whilst you're thinking about participating, let me ask both Simon and Rob the following question. Do you agree with my fear, if that's the right way of putting it, that the Brexit honeymoon for Ireland and Luxembourg is coming to an end? They've had a tremendous boom over, not just because of Brexit, they've had a tremendous boom for a whole host of reasons, including Brexit over the last 5 years and indeed longer. But is the honeymoon potentially coming to an end at the end of this year? There is, I do note again the sort of the tone of the CBI's review of CP86. They are really serious about building substance, and the same applies very much so, if not even to a greater extent, in Luxembourg. They've got that going on. Where are they going to find all these people to do all of this? And at the same time, they've got the AMF and potentially, I wouldn't say hostility at all from ESMA, but they've got a somewhat suspicious ESMA. They've got Commission doing what it wants to do, trying to toughen everything up. The British are not there to help ameliorate the worst things in these directives that will be coming out of Brussels. So how do you think this is going to play out? Is it going to be a good few future years for Ireland and Luxembourg, or do you think that they could find things quite a lot tougher in the coming years? As you said yourself, I think both Simon and Rob, the Luxembourg and Irish authorities do not want any changes in delegation. They want it to stay as it is. That's exactly what they want. But I think you'd both agree that that isn't going to be the case. It's likely potentially to change, notwithstanding the fact that, as you said, there is a Luxembourg-UK delegation agreement. I'd love for you both to try and comment on that. I see we have some questions coming in, but please take those points, if you will, Rob and Simon.
I mean, it's been a long honeymoon. Maybe now it's a 7-year itch for them, but since Brexit. Yeah, I mean, I think in the natural course of things, when Brexit came in, the vote, and then they had plenty of time to plan, particularly with the shenanigans that were going on over here, and the length of time it took for us to get even to the divorce deal. You know, I don't actually think it's an essential threat to them in terms of what they do at the moment. And don't forget that Luxembourg is becoming increasingly popular for non-EU managers like the US and so on as a way into Europe, now that eventually they're getting used to that. But what I would say is that maybe there'll be it's a retrenchment for the next few years rather than an expansion. And don't forget that there are places like Frankfurt and Paris that are very keen to take up business from the UK, where there is clearly much more substance and experience.
You got any comments on that, Rob?
Yeah, I think I think that what Brexit has really exposed is the lack of focus by regulators collectively on delegation. Because once, when the UK or when the London was wholly within the EU and it was all passportable and all part of the same regime, no one really focused on the level of oversight of delegation out of Luxembourg or Ireland. It's only now that the UK is going to become a third country that the really focus is really there. And I think, Simon, that you're right. The questions will start to be asked by other regulators, which is, wait a minute, if I've got my investors in an Irish or Luxembourg fund range who are delegating outside the EU, and let's say predominantly to the UK, I am relying on their level of supervision about how well that delegation is being delivered. And so how do I feel about that in terms of protecting my investors who are then being offered that fund for distribution, because it's probably, you see, it's an H product that could be passported around Europe. So I think you can see why the French and German regulators might start to want to understand the level of supervision. And it may be, I'm not saying it's the case, but it may be, for a long time there has been a sense that the Irish and Lux regulators are very close to the local industries. They do a lot of mutual, marketing is very much part of their growth strategy for both jurisdictions. And I do wonder if the regulators, want to see a bit more stringency, which you can see coming through in CP86. I would feel that the pressure has been brought to bear in conversations on both Luxembourg and Ireland. I mentioned Luxembourg not signing off on secondments of marketing people to the third-party managers. You can see both of them have tightened their regime, have tightened their expectations, the raising the bar on substance. That may well be, because the pressure's on, but also they can see the direction of travel, and they're trying to demonstrate that they are the right regulators for the fund location in terms of delegation and those funds being distributed. So you can see that tension continuing, starting and growing, I think, within Europe. And it's not necessarily clear that France, Germany, or elsewhere wants to be the fund location of choice within Europe, but it has always surprised me that other jurisdictions have not looked at the value of being a fund centre, both in terms of jobs, ancillary services, administration, custody, etc., and not wondered why they are not competing more. They've left that mantle to Ireland and Luxembourg to some degree, and you can see that. And to your point, I think longer term, if we get Europe focus more on its own capital markets, focus more on its own infrastructure around trade, deployment of assets, wealth, etc., and those financial centres start to develop. If they have the settlement provision and all the other sort of plumbing that's required for a manager, they will attract the managers to those locations. That is more likely to be Frankfurt or Paris than Ireland or Luxembourg. Ireland or Luxembourg does not have that capital markets industry, does not have the depth of talent to grow those businesses. And you do wonder at some point whether managers will increasingly say, if I'm based in Paris and Frankfurt, why not use a French or German fund? Because actually there are some synergies of substance about being in the same jurisdiction. There are some tax benefits. And so, there'll be lots of reasons why we may see some tensions emerging within the EU marketplace around where the fund location should be.
Thank you. I see people taking advantage of the Q&A facility. I don't think we've had anyone yet brave enough to be called up onto the screen, but I repeat, sorry to keep repeating myself, but I do encourage you, should you wish to do so, to try and take advantage of that. We'd love to see you up here with us. So let me take one of the Q&A questions. Presumably it's come from Ireland. Do the panel have any comments on the CBI letter that shows that the CP86 compliance challenges appear to be more pronounced in the established FMCs, fund management companies, that were set up prior to the Brexit decision? Simon,
well, I think that demonstrates my point about the bar. Oh, sorry. I was just saying, it demonstrates my point about the bar being raised, and that I think some of the managers have been around for longer. They may well have been operating in a world of less scrutiny because there wasn't the UK as a potential third country and delegation, etc. And they were operating at a level of substance and governance and systems and processes, etc. And as Simon said, as mentioned in the report, those larger ones probably are relying more on centralised risk systems and services and group activities. But the bar has moved. You know, the threshold for substance and the expectation about what happens locally. I once heard you know, the European mancos described as being, you know, the Frankensteins that haven't woken up yet, because until we get, you know, until we get the UK as a third country, no one has really focused on the fact that, you know, these mancos, they are the lead manager. They have the risk and responsibility in relation to the fund. And you may be a UK manager with a name and a brand, and you may have done everything historically. Well, going forward, no, you are actually providing these services to them. They are delegating to you. They have oversight over you, and so you can see why, you know, the pressure's there to say, no, well, then they need the substance, they need the risk people, they need the seniority, they need to be able to demonstrate that they're doing their governance properly. And I think that, you know, the sentiment of Frankenstein in terms of a lot of the UK managers have not realised, from a regulatory point of view, the balance of power that's shifted to the AFIMs and the Mancos from their, maybe their, you know, their parent organisations, they see it. So you can see why the longer term ones are maybe, you know, are now being asked to catch up, because the direction of travel is more substance, you know, and more governance. So you can see why that could naturally happen.
Is it fair to say that given what how you've responded to that question, is it fair to say we all knew that about the Mancos, and there's been, as we all know, a tremendous boom in these Manco hosting platforms in Ireland and Luxembourg. They've been sold and merged at extraordinary multiples, and there've been some more of those in the last few weeks, and it's gone quite bananas. But, you know, we all paid, or everyone knew what was in the regulations, but, you know, it was a bit of sort of, I wouldn't say it was some of the spirit was swept under the carpet, or the letter was swept under the carpet, and the spirit was certainly not particularly there, because what it really was, at the end of the day, frequently, if it was a London-based fund house, it really, ultimately, at the end of the day, don't tell anyone this, but it really was, the big decisions were made in London, the marketing was done from London, portfolio management was done from London. Yes, there were these operations in Dublin and Luxembourg. By the way, if you try and explain how a Manco works, and I have tried this on a number of occasions in New York to American managers, and how, you know, you delegate the portfolio management, they think you're a Martian from Mars. They just don't understand it. And we'll have to give up this, that, and the other. Well, why do we do that? And I said, well, this is the way the EU works. But coming back to my question is, do you think that the letter of the law, the spirit of the law was not truly observed up until now, but now, as you say, Rob, we're becoming a third party country, and we have this greater insistence as evidence in the CP86 review, and doubtless will be the equivalent things coming out of Luxembourg. Do you think we are going to see a much greater insistence upon the letter of the law being observed? And what does that really mean for these Manco hosting platforms in Dublin and Luxembourg? Because, you know, have they got the capability of taking on a portfolio management role? Have they got the capability of taking on a distribution role? If they're a third-party Manco hosting platform, does that mean a different salesman for each fund? They could be competitive funds. I mean, how does that work?
I mean, I think that, you know, clearly you're pointing to a certain degree of age-induced stress within certain structures. And this all chimes with the current noises coming out of ESMA and the Commission and the things that I was discussing previously. So I think, you know, there is going to be a tilting of the scales here. But, you know, people have been pretty good at adapting to the post-Brexit environment in the first place. And maybe there has been observation only within the letter of the law and not the spirit. But I think, you know, the letter of the law has been pretty clear, but it's also clear that ESMA and the Commission are spotting gaps in it. And I think you're right. I mean, I think from a matter of practicality, getting Mancos to not only deal with risk management, but to take a substantial or a substantive role in portfolio management is going to be logistically difficult. Don't forget also, by the way, as an aside, that one of the things you mentioned was the UK in the longer term. And if we manage to get our act together and become effectively an onshore stroke offshore centre, that is more of a long-term threat than dealing with the slow drip of steady regulation.
Yeah, I did want to bring that up, so let's do that now. Simon and Firth and I, was it 18 months ago, Simon? It wasn't an official event, but we were on a panel in a parliamentary committee room where the topic under discussion was whether or not post-Brexit, this was still when Theresa May was Prime Minister, so we've gone a long way since then, whether post-Brexit we would potentially start competing with EU jurisdictions like Ireland and Luxembourg. And as we said in that parliamentary committee room, back in the days when George Osborne was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is a long time ago now, the Treasury did look into that. They did some marketing trips, I think, to Tokyo and to New York. And AIMA at the time, again, this is 18 months to 2 years ago, has written a paper, was looking into that as well. So there has work been done. It's not like nothing's been has been progressed on this. And I can see with Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda, and one of the reasons perhaps that he didn't want to, won't agree to any form of oversight in terms of subsidies from the EU is these free ports thing. I always use the example of Liverpool, but it could be anywhere. I could see maybe Liverpool emerging as an international financial services centre, not all that far from Dublin as it happens, but much cheaper rents, much cheaper salaries, much cheaper office space or house prices, etc. Is this potentially something that we will see in the medium to long term? Any comments from either of you?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's been discussed in that context before, and it has been bandied around a bit, was clearly, you know, as you're inferring, the economic bonus from generating more jobs from having an effective onshore fund code, if you like, with all the permutations and a la carte options in it. And so that would mean that, yes, if you're building up depository and administrator type support, it's going to be, it could be like it is in Ireland, and like, you know, wherever that's outsourced to Cork or Shannon or wherever, which many of the Irish admins do. Intriguing. I mean, Liverpool, maybe. It's got two good football clubs.
Yeah, and they sing the fields of Athenry, Liverpool. We've got a couple more questions, and sadly we're running out of time. But I promised my last effort to get someone to try out the hands up facility. But let me, in the meantime, come to one of the written questions. And someone has written: will Boris step up pressure on the government, step up pressure on equivalents, and are we facing open war on the provision of financial services from the UK? Someone has written.
Well, I think the pressure's there on. The pressure's there on. For equivalents. That, I mean, John Glenn, the City Minister, wrote an open letter to the House of Lords committee at the end of September, expressing, you know, the UK government's frustration at the EU's approach to equivalence. So I think they've been making that clear, and they're pushing for equivalence recognition, not least because, you know, I think in the government's mind, you know, the statute books as they stand now, there is no greater place of equivalence, given that most of the EU statute is absorbed into UK law. So, you know, come the 1st January. I think the issue, the conversation point is more around, because the government has said that they are wanting to look for regulatory divergence, and the EU is going to focus on the extent of that divergence, how it is shared between both of them, how, you know, if regulatory alignment is going to move apart, when and how does equivalence fall apart because of that, or become non-equivalent because of that. So I think the EU probably it's not that they're not accepting as equivalents now. They've got one eye on where the UK wants to go, and to understand their part and their responsibility in monitoring equivalence, and how the UK will be, you know, discussing that with them, discussing the direction of travel, so they don't get caught cold. But I think the pressure is there. Open financial services, well, look, you know, like any other industry, governments compete, right? And blocks of global markets compete, whether it's manufacturing or financial services. And I think, you know, all things we've said so far today, you know, we know that Paris and Frankfurt and others, Netherlands, you know, are interested in trying to grab some of what they see as, you know, high wage, high profit, high skills, you know, financial services jobs from London. But I think that was always the case. You know, Brexit will just give them more chance to use regulatory manoeuvres and rules to enforce some of that. Yes.
I mean, I think it's extraordinary that I think I'm right in saying the US, of course, and many other countries around the world have third-party equivalents with the EU. So here we have a situation. I mean, this isn't this.
No, I don't think that's right, actually, Simon. I don't think the EU's ever accepted the SEC as an equivalent level of oversight. I think that is an area of continuing negotiation, I think.
Really? I didn't know that. But they certainly have, or did, although there was a problem with the Swiss stock exchange with the Swiss. And I had assumed it with other major markets around the world, they have equivalence agreements. But okay, well, let's just let me use the example of the Swiss, even though there was a problem over the stock exchange. It seems quite incredible to me, and it's the Alice in Wonderland world we're entering, whereby the EU, I mean, the UK was part of the EU since it became the EU, was part of it from the EEC days onwards. We're completely regulatory aligned up until this point anyway. And they were not even able to get equivalents away before the end of this year. Do you have any insights as to why it all fell apart? Because I thought it was progressing, it was supposed to have been done by the end of June, as I said in my presentation, that I don't think anyone more was to blame than the other side, but the EU and the UK failed to recognize each other's regimes by that date. And then the Latvian guy responsible for financial services, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce again, just said, I'm sorry, we're too busy. What's going on? I mean, that really is very, very strange, isn't it?
Well, I think the recognises how important financial services is to London and the UK. So it's one of their trump cards, isn't it, to hold off. And I think they have always said that they didn't necessarily see that equivalence needs to be in the free trade agreement, and it could be something that's discussed, in side agreements or subsequently. So, and the EU does like to do this stage posting. We had to do the withdrawal agreement first before we could start the conversation on the free trade agreement. So, as I say, I think there are over 40 areas of potential for equivalence. Some of those have been, recognised. Some are, my understanding, in draft. So it's not as though there isn't movement. It will be part of the mix, right? You often hear the phrase trade fishing for financial services. There are both sides holding cards they want to play, I guess.
One of the sticking points, I think, was that we wanted a longer, I think the equivalence can be terminated on 30 days notice. And I think for something longer than that. Just while we're on equivalence quickly, and you mentioned it earlier, Simon, and I know Robert brought it up earlier, is the GDPR and data transfers, where there's what could be a clearer area of existing equivalence. So we brought in the UK GDPR and said we're just going to carry on with the GDPR resprayed as that. But there's no EU Commission adequacy decision on that. So transferring data after 31st of December, or if there's no deal, you're going to have to rely on the data transfer exemptions.
Okay. Sadly, we're very much running out of time. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask you to give a short, pithy answer to this question in the seconds we've got left. Rob sounds a bit more optimistic than you, Simon. Are you, broadly speaking, in a optimistic, pessimistic about how this is going to, the relationship, particularly between the UK and Luxembourg and Ireland, given where we are, is going to unfold next year? Or are we looking at a potentially nasty divorce? We've been talking earlier on about honeymoons, now we're talking about divorces. Are we looking at a potential really nasty divorce, and where each side is going to throw whatever it can at the other side, and it could all unravel? As someone said to me the other day, actually the trade agreement isn't all that important, unless you're in a specific industry, but it's the spirit behind it that does matter, because there's going to be so much stuff that will be coming up that we can't foresee, and if we're at sort of at daggers drawn, it could be quite nasty. Very quickly, if you could respond to that with a pithy short sort of observation each.
Cooling off period, retrenchment, slow rapprochement, much more important things to deal with for everybody longer term post-COVID. So I think pragmatism will win the day.
Rob?
I think that's right. Though you can never rule out just some absolute calamitous event, especially with Macron wanting to be quite bullish on one side and Boris being a populist on the other. The sight of French fishermen being arrested and towed into English ports by the English Navy, it's just going to, British Navy, it's just going to, you can just imagine how small things could escalate. And I agree with Simon, the best hope is a cooling off period and a sense of the need to move forward together on things like, don't forget, cooperation, policing, there's security, there's lots of areas where we absolutely need to continue to work together positively. So hopefully, those things will happen, and then the rest will come back to a sensible negotiation. There's no reason for the free trade agreement to be the end of negotiations. Hopefully it's the start, but you could just see something going horribly wrong that just causes a bad atmosphere, and you can't move forward without some sense of goodwill on both sides.
Well, thank you both for your contributions. Thank you, those of you out there following this, and thank you for those that sent in questions. Much appreciated. As I said at the beginning, this is the first of several. We've got another one coming up in November, another one in December, another one in January. We may well go on past that. We also are going to be doing white papers through the tracker, and we're going to have, I didn't mention this earlier, through the tracker, your questions answered facility, so people can, subscribers can fire in questions. We will either attempt to answer those ourselves or give them to experts like Rob and Simon to answer. So we see this at the beginning of a very interesting period that will go on probably for quite a long time to come. So hopefully you'll be with us in the future. Again, thank you for joining us. I hope you have a good rest of your Friday and a very good weekend, and see you the next time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.